All right, yeah, good afternoon, y'all. Thanks for having me. I don't know what you guys do here, but it's a very cool place, although it's difficult to navigate and get into, so maybe you guys, I don't know, counterfeit money. I'm not sure what you do, but I'm interested in learning. My name is Kevin, and I have a book that I'm going to share with you about Wicker, and I'll talk about that in a moment, but I want to say that, generally the work that I do is really about telling and listening to stories. And I think that's something that my work as an educator, as a cultural organizer at Young Chicago Authors, Louder Than a Bomb, at UIC, and all the other spaces that I operate in is very much about sharing space with people and getting a chance to listen to them. I think Chicago is probably produced some of the greatest listeners that the planet has been privy to. I kind of see myself in a tradition of some of these listeners. I think about folks like Upton Sinclair, who were significant in documenting some of the horrors of the meatpacking industry at the dawn of industrialization, and Ida B. Wells, who was documenting the horrors of Southern lynching and convincing the North that this was indeed going on. Studs Terkel, Gwendolyn Brooks, these folks who have done the work of listening to what is happening in the neighborhoods and reporting it to the city as a whole. And I think one of the travesties about a city like Chicago, and Chicago specifically, is that we remain one of the most segregated cities in the world. And that kind of segregation cannot be good for the wholeness, the totality of the polity. And so I think part of my work has also been to use the tools that I have at hand, the cultural tools of spoken word, hip-hop culture, hip-hop poetics, to try to actively desegregate the city. And one of the most powerful ways to do that, I've found, is through storytelling. Is that at the end of the day, we are very different from one another, and yet we also have some universal things that might connect us. And so hopefully, what you get out of today is not, that it's just about my story, but there'll be hopefully something that you connect to of your own story, and then therefore we're able to build a bridge and a new kind of bond. So that being said, I've been doing this work in the city for a very long time. I was born in a community that got renamed, like where we're standing. I don't know what do we call this neighborhood now? Cabrini Green? It's not Cabrini Green, but in the day it was. Do you know what I mean? And I was born in Newtown, which is now East Lakeview or Boys Town, and I lived there for a while and moved around that area for a while. And that neighborhood, when I was born, is very different than what it looks like now. I was kind of privy to the beginning a little. It's a little after my time, but I was born in a mostly Black and Puerto Rican community where very close to me, a street organization called the Young Lords, modeled after the Black Panther, started. Now, if you go to East Lakeview, there are no more of Young Lords. Do you know what I mean? It looks very different. That is the nature of some of the way neighborhoods change. But I wrote this book with the hope of trying to ask questions about what kind of cities do we want to live in the future? Do we want neighborhoods that are devoid of working people and artists? Or do we want, vibrant, robust neighborhoods that also have a plan to continue to include them, often because those are the people who make that neighborhood so vibrant, where inevitably then that attracts dollars and interest from businesses and other people who could come in and, move in, but hopefully not move out everyone who has lived there for the entirety of their lives, potentially. But that's a hope, you know what I mean? I remain optimistic in part because I'm around a lot of young people, and so I get to, I get to hear about their vision for a future that is, in a lot of ways, better than I'm older than most of y'all, our old-ass vision for what a world, city, planet, country can look like, So I'm going to share this book about Wicker Park. And I should say that my connection to Wicker Park is deep for a number of reasons. One, my grandfather moved from the Ukraine in 1906 to what was Westtown. And at the time when he moved, his family was fleeing the Cossacks, who were coming through the different neighborhoods. I don't think they were neighborhoods in the Ukraine. I don't know what they called them, like shtetl. I don't know, rural areas, and they were rounding up Jews and killing them, which was not good, being a Jew. And so, but the good thing about my family is that evidently they made very ill threads for the governor of that province, like they were tailors. And so the governor really rocked with my family, and he gave them a heads up that the Cossacks were coming through and that they should step at an appropriate time. And so they took the Red Star Line to Ellis Island, came to Chicago in 1906, moved into Westtown. Westtown at that time, mostly a Irish neighborhood. And my grandfather, named George Marcus Coval, thought he was slick, and he wanted to change his name and go by the pseudonym Murphy in the neighborhood so these big-ass, gingered Irish boys did not beat him up. Now, the thing about it is that my grandfather was a short, squat, dark Jew, and so they beat his ass anyway, but the joke was on them. Eventually, he called his cousins to the neighborhood, and it became the Ukrainian village, right? And so my whole life has revolved around that neighborhood, and I moved back to the neighborhood in 94. I started to go to parties in the neighborhood, house, hip-hop parties, started probably like 90, 91, but then moved back to the neighborhood in 94, 95 after playing semi-pro basketball overseas in Wales for a little bit of time, which is not saying much about my game. The condition of the Welsh game at the time was not outstanding, which is why I was able to play. But I came back to the neighborhood at that time and really tried to, I was trying to find myself as a young man and step toward a life of becoming a young artist. I made a decision at 19 that I wanted to write. I started messing around with writing in high school, and from what I'd heard, Wicker Park at that time was a burgeoning young artistic community, and I knew that to be true going to the parties in the neighborhood, but I was trying to find myself. And so the book kind of jumps off from there, and so I'm going to begin with one of the poems about me trying to do just that. This is a poem called Boy Becomes Man. Boy becomes man in the park. Sips brass monkey from a corner store bought with $1 and change. He heard it in a Beastie Boys song. His ID says he's old enough to drink alone in the new city. It's near midnight on a Friday. The streets swell with folks, but the boy will not speak to someone for days. During days off, he'll watch. He'll lose track of time. He'll listen to the city by learning it halt and grind and fire. The boy will aspire, but for now, there's a corkscrew unfurled in his hand for the walk home. His pocket got a knot in it. Tip scrambled for the little he makes. He scrambles. Scared someone will fuck with him. Scared no one will fuck with him. The new city's burped and birthed him. Got him drunk and taught him how to hold liquor, how to piss in an alley, how to run and cut through an alley, how to open someone's face like a bottle of wine. I had this gig, right, at a French bistro called Café Matou, and it was ill, and I write about it in the book, like this big section about the restaurant. And one of the guys that I write about, Leon, used to be the maitre d' at the like Chicago Standard Club or something like that. He probably was the illest, like the most talented waiter in the city, and he was back to work after retiring from the Standard Club because his wife needed money for her medication. She had leukemia or something like that. So Leon really put me on to the formal serving game. You know what I mean? So even now at dinner, I could like lift a salad with like just like a fork and a spoon in my hand and just do all sorts of slick shit, And so once you get a little bit of bread in your pocket as a young man, you think you could like start wiling out, and you just do outrageous things like, yo, I'm gonna ask a girl out on a date, and it doesn't go well, which is what this poem's about. It's called A Girl from the Neighborhood. I asked my man to ask your girl for your number, and bam, we got 22s, a honey brown, and walked the park. You said you wanted to hear something I wrote. I whispered a little rap in your ear beneath a giant oak. Met you at the gig, an after-school arts program Vero dragged you to. Her husband rhymed, and we worked together. You came to the settlement house on Augusta in the sweaty-ass air of August, hair pulled back slick. Said some funny shit about the food, smiled, said you wrote a bit too, and why that's some sweet spot you put your poem to. When I said, I'll pick you up at 7, you thought I meant 8. I was on white boy time and had to wait a half hour while you got ready, and you're not really little cousin Carlos, baby giant full of slick talk and jibarito, started to roast me on the wooden stairs I came to know your uncle built. Carlos bust out and said, yo, you look like that dude from Honey, I Shrunk the Kids. And all the little ones cracked rainbow-colored smiles like the freeze pops melting in their hands. And Carlos was victorious and not yet 11. Later, you told me his dad was killed a year ago a few blocks from where we stood. The sun sunk west, and all the apartments spread shadows on the ground, slow like a sheet unfurled in the few lovely moments that suspended above the earth, the bed, your body before finally falling. We made it out on Milwaukee, walked south, stopped in front of Earwax, the coffee shop I knew all the bus boys and could gee weed at. You looked inside, said you weren't hungry, said you didn't eat white people food, got mad at the idea of a veggie burger. All the new faces, the white faces, my own, in the glass, your eyes, wells like the school clothes, the lake, great ocean crossing, bacalao and African bloodline. You said you couldn't go there, this space wasn't for you. You wondered what we were doing here. A year and a half later, we'd yell in the vestibule. You'd rip my shirt and plastic buttons bounced down the steps. I came to know your uncle built, and of course, you were right. But I'd hoped this was something different, or I was, or this was the city big enough to love you in. Thanks, Joe. Thank you. Yeah. All right. Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah. You guys, we snap in our space like it's 68. You know what I mean? So feel free, engage as you wish. But yeah, certainly you don't have to be quiet during these poems. It's meant to be like in the tradition of call and response, kind of like church, although I'm a Jew, so I'm confused myself. But I mentioned this coffee shop, Earwax, which was one of the centers that we used to hang out in. I don't know if people remember the spaces back in the day. Another spot was Urbis Orbis, which was really a center. It was, currently, I don't even know what's there anymore, to be honest. I know if you know Myopic Books on Milwaukee Avenue, that was one of the iterations of where Earwax used to be. Urbis Orbis was another spot on North Avenue, and it's an interesting history of the building. It's still, I think, next to a currency exchange, but maybe they got rid of that too. But Urbis Orbis used to be a building where they made some sort of like very small part for a much larger machine. So it was an industrial space from like 30 to like 60. And then it went under and it became basically like a shooting gallery for heroin addicts and then later crackheads. And then it was taken over by this guy, Tom, who was a former heroin addict, who made it into a coffee shop and just opened up the space to that community. And that's where I kind of met my first everybody. You would just walk in and it was indiscernible who was pouring coffee and who worked there and if people slept there. Like it was just a lot of things were unsure about the place. But it was big and beautiful and people would play chess and talk about very like pretentious things that I didn't know. I'm like, yo, I don't know who the fuck Derrida is, but word. And then you could get, you could get like anything at these places and meet a lot of people. And so and then eventually Urbis Orbis became a cheetah gym, And then eventually, and I talk about it at the end of the book, upstairs is where this book kind of tracks 1994 to 2001. And in 2001, MTV's The Real World set up shop and built a loft in top of Urbis Orbis, which in my mind was a kind of death knell for the neighborhood. Although there are many, it's like, who do you ask? Well, then you'll get a different answer about what was the end of the neighborhood. But in my estimation, from my vantage point, the Real World was not a great look. And so, I still love the architecture in the building. I should say that this is a book that is inspired by the graphic novel and comic books. I grew up a latchkey kid, and so, hip-hop and the boombox absolutely saved me. Cartoons saved me. Comic books saved me. And so every poem is illustrated by a very talented young artist named Langston Hughes, who's from Champaign-Urbana, but for the last 7 years has lived in New Orleans. And so although Langston was not even born when I'm, getting a start as a young artist in Wicker Park, he's kind of translating my experience through memory, some photograph, video. We walked the neighborhood a ton while making this project, but Langston is also thinking about the rapid gentrification that's occurring in New Orleans post-Katrina. And so it's been an interesting synthesis between my experience and his artistic license and experience in building this book, which is about a process that we kind of now call gentrification, but that is certainly, not unique to Wicker Park, is not unique to Chicago, is a process that is happening around the planet. And so part of what I wanted to do was also recognize some of the folks from the neighborhood that made a big difference in my life. And this is a poem about this dude who was really like my first homie. And I met him at Urbis Orbis. He worked at Earwax. So this is a poem called Rudy. Rudy was a sailor. 2 tours in the first Gulf War. A cast-off. After we met, I saw him everywhere. He's well loved on Milwaukee Avenue and seems to work at half the restaurants. He could get anything you ever wanted. Opium, a pocket knife, spray paint. He always had a girl. A thin, dark-haired beauty, new to the city, small dog in tow. He'd end up crashing with her for a few weeks. And after they fought and broke, he'd hit the block like a summer jam. He'd paint canvases of flowers he saw on a rock. Clusters of bellflower, bunches of yellow chamomile. He'd drop acid and skateboard downtown, unanchored, well past business hours when buildings would flower like bombs in the sky. It was a time when no one had a last name, only a first, followed by a brief description. Rudy, who works at Earwax. Rudy with the ponytail. Rudy with eyes like whirlpools. Rudy with tattoos of violets. Rudy who skateboards. Rudy with PTSD. Rudy who said to meet him here. Rudy who said I could stay with you. Rudy who owes me $40. You know Rudy, the sailor, the painter, the busboy, veteran ghost addict. Rudy the con artist, hookup and petty thief. Personal chef to the homeless. Rudy, the hero of Milwaukee Avenue. My first friend in the new city. And the sad thing about all this stuff is that, like, I don't know where these people are really anymore. You know what I mean? Like, everyone I know from the neighborhood outside of Sharkula, and if you ever spent much time on Milwaukee Avenue, either in Wicker or Logan Square, Sharkula has certainly asked if you like hip hop, and we'll sell you a CD or vinyl. And if you see him, please, it's only common courtesy. It's like street tax. You know what I mean? If you're on Milwaukee Avenue, you owe Sharkula some loot. Feel me? I write about Sharkula in the book, but outside of him, like, I don't know anyone who's still in the neighborhood. Everyone has been pushed out, or they've moved, or they're for whatever reason they're gone. And to me, that's a kind of, it's certainly sad, but it begs that question. It's like, these people who built the neighborhood gave so much to the neighborhood. They were the ones who built it up, who let, like, all those tech company startup joints, like, that's what attracted those companies to that place to begin with. It was the integrity of what was happening, on the street. And now folks can't afford to be there anymore. One of the places that meant a lot to me as a young artist was, if you know Division and Wood, right? There's Max, which is like on the southwest corner. Max used to be connected to this, like, run of places, and one of the spots in that, like, little area was called the Bop Shop, which was a jazz club. And some of the, Chicago has a great tradition of everything. I'm a Chicago centrist, so I also will say, like, yeah, how Chicago invented air, but Chicago's jazz has been, incredible for decades and decades. I think of Sun Ra's contribution not only to Afrofuturism, but also like free jazz, and what he took that hard bop, but kind of made it free in the AACM, and all these great musicians that have come in his wake. A lot of them were posted up at the Bop Shop, and for whatever reason, whatever miracle allowed this to happen, they agreed to a Tuesday night, they would turn over the club to hip-hop artists, which was not really prominent in, like, 94. Do you know what I mean? Like, people would still, like, hip-hop now, of course, is pop. Like, we know hip-hop to sell us Doritos, But in the day, hip-hop was still, people didn't, even jazz heads might not consider it music, and there was certainly that intergenerational debate. So it was significant that this place would allow us to come in and do something. And so it was an open mic that meant the world to me. We currently at Young Chicago Authors, you're all invited. We run the longest running youth open mic in the city. I don't know, maybe other places, but we do a Tuesday night open mic now that is inspired by the openness, the vibrancy, the creativity of this space called the Bop Shop. So I'm going to read this poem called The Bop Shop, which goes like this. Jazz embraced its son. Old heads and kangos recognize the snot-nosed, foul-mouthed motherfuckers in oversized denim. A Tuesday work night to put in work. When a freestyle was off the dome in the tradition of the city's great improvisers, Phil Cochran and Viola Spolin. Glasses sweat like the crowd, gathered in layers before the bandstand. Hoodied monks, strong heads nod in approval. A ritual to keep the crowd moving. Young bucks might fuck up, which meant heads would stop and you could get stomped, but homeboy would return next week after practice. Raps, gymnastics, kids flipping out empty lots in a mattress, an art and kung fu dance. When MCs were swordsmen who carried words in a velvet case and polished brass when they get to the bar. All day long, a generation mumbling to themselves over the rumble of L trains. Madmen, superheroes who held down day jobs and emerged in the night with bombastic gnome de plumes. There was Shadow Master, Long Shot, Juice, I Spy, Ange 13, Prime, and Capital D. Tuesdays, a proving ground, word shop, workshop, masterclass, Shogun, swap meet spot to see new poets from sides of the city didn't want you to see. We were out there on division, catching wreck and getting open. And to me, like, that space became so important, you know, because that space, the ability to just walk into a room and be like, yo, this is the shit I was working on, let me share it with you, and to get immediate feedback, you know, was significant as my hope, this dream of pursuing the idea that I was gonna be a writer. Like, it wasn't, you know, I was whack a ton of times, but there would be like maybe a seed where somebody might, you know, as I would walk out of the spot, they'd be like, yeah, that was cool, come back. And that was all I needed, you know? Of course, if you spent any time in Chicago, if you have had a beverage or two in Chicago, you know that there is an unsung hero in the city's late night known as the Tamale Guy. And, you know, I think at this point, like, it is a whole squad. But Langston made an illustration of the Tamale Guy. The streetwear brand Juggernaut made it into a T-shirt. I think there's like 1 or 2 T-shirts left, but I wanted to honor, you know, someone who stays hooking up working people, and so this is this is called the Tamale Guy. You guys familiar with? It says a lot about you guys, by the way. I see what kind of company it is now. This is. You guys are about to drink in like 30 minutes, I think. The Tamale Guy got hundreds in an igloo cooler, hot and dense, stuffed with queso and peppers, pork or corn, delicious and delivered to dingy bars littered across Chicago's last late night. The Tamale Guy is a hero of sorts, unknown to the masses, unmasked and cloaked in dimly lit dives, weaving through packed houses and some sad scatterings of last calls, in flak jacket flannel, dodging flailing elbows and mixed drink condensation. The Tamale Guy appears from thin air, the dust and bustle of Western Ave. The Tamale Guy feeds the multitude, hipsters and punks, artists and waitresses, after midnight Denzians who need a break and stiff drink and something to soak it all up. The Tamale Guy must have a family, some army who helps him wake and resuscitate for this second hustle. The Tamale Guy might carry mail by day or punch buttons on a clock at a factory, might live in Pilsen and wander the south branch of the river near Ashland on the weekend and watch fishermen lure smelt. The Tamale Guy lures the hungry, feeds the drunk for a couple of bucks. The poor, after all the pours, he's there in the lonely of night. The Tamale Guy is there. Cool. All right. Look at y'all. Super, super hip. So Langston, you know, was, again, like, you know, comic book, graphic novel. This is one of the pieces that's in the book, Ode to the Dive Bar. We ended up, let's see, that's it, I guess. That didn't work. But there's a poem that we made. So there's a poem that we made into a music video that I was going to, Charlotte, you do. Yeah, thank you. Okay, thank you.
You just swipe.
Oh,
And hit play.
I don't. That's amazing.
I know.
Yeah. It's incredible what you figured out. Yeah, we'll make some noise for Charlotte. Yo. I mean, this is. Thank you. Yeah. Well, it's not my computer. That's the best excuse I could say. We made this music video. By music video, I mean like a short film to a poem that I wrote. And we made I make a music video for every book because in my mind I'm still a rapper. But I wanted to play this for you, and then I'll read one or two more poems and open it up for a conversation. This is an ode to the dive bar. The long drunk room, a darkened sanctuary. Windows blocked opaque to make day insignificant. Light impaired. In here's timeless. A deprivation tank to meditate when the sky falls and you need to revel in pissy swill and the certain stench of someone else's body. In here's all better. 99 problems and a bottle of beer on the wall. The condensation from whiskey on the rocks is holy water when applied right. A pit stop vacation from the day for those who can never afford one. A Hades between work and the work of home. A bridge to the well and wet ring a glass makes. There's a myriad of reasons you might be mourning here. There's a popcorn machine, a bag of Ruffles, a jukebox willing to suck your dirty bills for a little bit of funk. The spot peeks at you out a side street. It's old style neon and the window winks, nods to your anonymity. Even a regular can disappear here on the round and spin of a stool. Beneath 1,000 thighs rubbed on the low. Skirts, junk touched in jeans. Hips mashed together against the evergreen of a pool table. Cool hid night in a bottle. Here, people know your name and forget it and shout it in anger and elation. So much has spilled, and I've spilled so much and spilled onto a seat that saved me on the occasion I needed to spill into someone. Respite or retreat, here's fellowship, a seat reserved any day of the week. This Thanksgiving family of strangers, ancient hall brimming with inebriated comrades. A cheers to you, our glasses raised and empty. All right. No, thank you. Charlotte, thanks again. Yeah, so, you know, the thing with these places that I think made the neighborhood and that I love so much, and for me kind of make a kind of city livable, is I fear that these places are disappearing, you know. I know they're disappearing. And, you know, I feel like I am culpable for it, and this process is much larger than any one individual. It's a complex series of history and global economies that merge together to, you know, change physical locales. But I think that we can be accountable. I certainly know that my generation of artists we didn't know what was coming, you know, and I felt like we were kind of canaries in the mine, you know, or chum in the water, that we were used. It seemed, you know, to attract other things, and then, you know, forcing not only. Listen. No, it's okay. It's got very meta. No, thank you. Charlotte stays saving the whole day, so. But you know, at the same time, it's like I know, like all of us like and want, you know, nice things, right? Like schools and houses and like delicious bites of food, right? So this is, you know, you see it coming now. Like I like traveling. This book is written over the course of about a year and a half as I was traveling with the last book, and so I was thinking about Oakland and Brooklyn and Miami and Detroit and London and all these other places, and so you see, you know, these kind of notes of what is to come, and I started to kind of think about some of those notes. So this is towards the end of the book, after all this, you know, all this movement has happened. This is called the Prefixes in. Nothing in the new city's organic. Small batch sweet buttercream, mustache service counter, too bothered to barista who wants to be a millionaire. It's so expensive to eat well. I can't find a juice less than $12. The best bite in the world, spicy tuna on fried Japanese eggplant. It's nicer getting robbed this way, my mom says. The old city was scary. The new city small and cute. The new city downloads cupcakes. The new city Ubers from one organic boutique to the next. GFC, Gentrified chicken. Long wooden tables from the Park District painted in bright jewel tones. Feng shui walls peppered with old news and bricolaged frames. Lines of white meat out the door for an hour since the reader raved of non-GMO Amish farm birds rolled in rice powder, fried in coconut and kale oils. A 2-piece here's more than an 8-piece on 87th Street. No apple, orange, sweet potato slaw. We're a long way from the empire Harold Pierce and his wife Hilda built when no one would feed black folk a quick and necessary meal, 5 years before Ray Kroc, 2 years before the Colonel, the Colonial. And then this is the last piece in the book, which is I'm thinking about a lot of things now. And Louder Than a Bomb is our youth poetry festival. We, in the spring, will enter our 20th year of the festival, and I invite you out again. But for real, like it's and I'm biased, but it is like a very dope cultural event. And because Chicago cultural space is so segregated, I've been pressed to see another space that is as vibrant and diverse and representative of who is in the city as a Louder Than a Bomb event. But our theme this year is based off of Muhammad Ali's poem when at Harvard during a press conference he was asked for a poem, and seemingly randomly, improvisationally, he answered the journalist. He said, me, we, which is, I think, technically the smallest poem in the world. And I think then, too, that makes me think about what we're trying to do, but also Toni Morrison talked about not being restricted to the tyranny of the I, that oftentimes communities that are under or unrepresented, that a writer sometimes has the responsibility to speak for and in the voice of the we. And I think part of our mission with this work of storytelling, of creating spaces where we can share, essential ideas and narratives with one another is about that transition from the me to the we. That we are unique individuals unto ourselves. We are the only ones who exist in our body. We are as different as whatever metaphor you want to use. And that's true. And that also we have a responsibility to the polity. We have a responsibility beyond the I, into the communal we. And so the last poem in the book tries to speak for me and my comrades at the time, a generation that is lost in a lot of ways, and certainly is lost from the neighborhood and will not return. This is the final poem, the eponymous poem in the book. This is called Everything Must Go. We're looking for work, looking to move out our parents' crib to afford some affordable housing, a 3-bedroom with 5 people, something to imagine a life of our own making. We're 18 and 22, living for the first time with roommates not our blood. We're from the neighborhood and the one over. This one's over. Our parents split and moved to the burbs. Our auntie lives out west. We work at the new restaurant your boss just ate at. We sold as kids weed out back. We boost and rack and claim our sister's kid on our income tax. We live with our producer, our girl's girl, a giant loft of squatters, our shit in a bag. We got the gall to think there's something different than life intended. We're tired of working at the bank or grocer or business our parents moved here for. We drink what the elders left. 7 and 7s, gin and tonics, old turkey and old hats. We're new birds trying to fly. We drop shit like pigeons damn near daily. We're making it up. We mash up records and tongues. We mess up daily. We step on E with speed to meet Molly. We out here styling, glammed up, roughneck timmed and roller skates. We house, we rave. We spend whole afternoons blunted watching cartoons for aesthetic clues. We know the names of everyone who works the corner store. We're here to stay until the landlord says everything must go. Thanks, y'all. Thank you. So, I was hoping, as much as I like to talk, I really do like to listen and engage and have a bit of a conversation. What's going on here?
It's a throwable mic.
Oh.
See, you can toss this.
Okay. All right. I thought it was church for a second. You were going to pass the. Because it kind of looks like. It looks like a collection, like slash a giant thing of tissue, and so, I mean, respectfully, I don't know, yeah, but this is cool. So if you talk, okay, all right. So listen, if you want to, I don't know, I would like to talk to y'all. So let me, okay, I'm not gonna throw it at you because that'd be.
I'm just reading questions from online, so we have a lot more people listening from online. So,
What's up, y'all? Hey.
Kevin mentioned that the young people he works with have visions for the future of the city that are beyond what older people have envisioned. What is your vision for the future of cities, and what are some examples of new ideas from young people?
Yeah.
Oh, you have your mic up
Okay.
there.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, damn. Do I? Well, you could throw it to the next person.
Okay.
All right. That's a great question. So, for me, and I think this is kind of what I've learned and understood over the last. I've been teaching in alternative high schools in Chicago since '97, which I could talk about how I got involved, but I never thought I'd be a teacher, and I don't really consider myself a teacher. I consider myself more of just a curator of space. And some of the things that I've learned in that time, that people will go to a space because of the resources that community has to offer. And so if we continually under or disinvest from the public goods of a neighborhood, then people will be forced to leave that neighborhood. I.e., if schools are not up to par with other schools around the city, then people will make a transition. The city of Chicago has lost, hundreds of thousands of black folks because of a deliberate continued disinvestment in infrastructure in black and brown communities. And so I think what I've seen and been privy to is that grand inequity in public education, because the high schools in the Chicagoland area are not equitable. And so for one, I think we need to have, I think that's part of why, and I know this is potentially a divisive topic, but I think that's certainly part of what I heard from teachers is part of the reason why they were out on strike, is to make a case that had to do with a overall systemic critique of a system that is flawed and deeply unjust. So one, invest in quality public schools across the board. Two, I think that we need to have a plan for affordable housing. It's not enough to have when someone like a big developer comes through, they have a nominal amount of what they consider to be mixed income properties, but those often are subsidized and unattainable for people who need affordable housing. And so I think that we have to have a plan for working people, for artists in neighborhoods, because they will retain the vibrancy and culture of those neighborhoods. And what I've heard young people say, what I've seen them do time and again, is gravitate toward spaces where their cultural practice is not criminalized. So often in the city of Chicago, if you enter a store, if you're a young person of color, if you enter a museum, you will be tracked. And in schools themselves, you have to walk through metal detectors in order to go study science, which doesn't seem right that we it seems like the school to prison pipeline is made manifest on a daily basis for some young people, and I think they gravitate towards spaces where they can be themselves without apology and under no pretense that they will have to change up what they're doing. And so those are the kind of spaces we try to create, which are essentially just like, do y'all. Like, do you, and we have some framework around how we organize and operate. But I think that those spaces are important, and I think in those spaces, if young people begin to build with one another across the various social demographic boundaries that keep them from building with one another, they will also imagine and envision a city that is, much flyer than the current one. Yeah. Who else, y'all? There was another hand, I feel like. My man, are you trying to? No? Yeah, okay. All right, there you go.
Hey, I I thought it was really interesting when you talked about like your grandfather and him growing up in what is now like Ukrainian village, and the fact that like these stories took place in a very different, like the same area but a very different landscape than it did. And even reading like people like Nelson Algren who wrote about the same area too, I guess like how do you take some of the historical context of the neighborhood and still kind of like appreciate it and apply it into some of the things that you work on, like with young Chicago authors in that same neighborhood today?
Yeah. I think that for me, both as a writer and as an educator, there's two strands that I'm tracking. One is that, we all see ourselves, I think, we're inheritors of a Chicago literary tradition. And so Nelson Algren figures very prominently in that tradition. And I think, in some ways, like the matriarch of all of it for us is Miss Gwendolyn Brooks, who was reporting. She considered her writing a kind of verse journalism, and she told young writers all the time that your responsibility is to tell the stories that are in front of your nose. And so to me, that kind of, binds us to the block, essentially. And hip-hop is rooted in a similar practice of representing the local. One of the things I love about hip-hop poetic practice is that if you are paying attention to the lyric, you'll get, local and, rapidly changing slang from different cities across the planet. The way, Rakim spoke about, let's say, his experience in Long Island in the 80s is very different than some of the vernacular that Too Short was then using in a similar moment, but, articulating an experience of a funk community out of Oakland garages. You know what I mean? And I love that about hip hop, and I love that about writing. That for me, it's in the minutia, it's in the details, and that's certainly what I try to do as a writer, to incorporate the world around you. And then I also try to do that in the with other young artists that I'm privileged to work with, is to start with what you know and what you hear. That around us all the time is a language of poetry, but we've kind of made poetry, like most things we do in public education, we teach it backwards. Like we start with the old dead shit, and then as a student you're like, yo fam, I don't know this, I'm bored to death, like in fact I'm not coming to class anymore, as opposed to being like, yeah, actually, like what you heard on the bus today is poetry, so let's start there. If a Starbucks appears on your block, or if you have an empty lot on your block, that actually speaks to like a much, more interesting way to get at global economic history or civilization. And let's start there and track now back, as opposed to back into, you get to like the civil rights movement sometimes, and you know what I mean? And so I feel like we try to flip pedagogically the model of how we teach, and that certainly has been effective for me as a writer in thinking about what I have to write about. That specter of what is before me, and that before me is both now, in the future, but also what has been here prior. And so that's the powerful thing about having, like, my dad is the king of the, like, that used to be. You know what I mean? Like my dad drives a Lyft, and even like if I'm ever in a car with him, which he's not a good driver, so I try not to be, but he stays on the, oh, that used to be. And as a kid, I was like, oh fam, I know you just told me that. But now it's like, it's almost like a, indigenous traditions in Australia, they talk about the walkabout, which are songs that are sung, and to look to the right because there's like a burial mound that coincides with the rising of a song, and you're like, oh, that's where your grandparents are buried, or whatever it was. That's where a war was fought. And driving with my dad in the city is like a walkabout. You know what I mean? Like there's so many places that he has connections to, and those stories are my stories. That's the stories of like, that's the stories like I then will leave to like whoever will read my book, you know what I mean? Like, and so to me, it's like, it's understanding that history is not just in the past, but like it is very much with us now. And how do we translate? I think that's also like a way to counter like a historical amnesia that I would say, whiteness is very guilty of. It's because we don't want to look at like what has been past, because we've like made the past and the present, very bloody. And it's painful, I think, to look at, but it's probably much more painful to live through. And so I think the import of that is to look and wrestle with what is past in order to justify and make right the now, got more online joints? Is that?
Unless anybody in here. Okay. I think most of us have heard of the negative effects of gentrification, yet it also feels like a somewhat inevitable part of the cycle of neighborhoods. What do you think is a healthier alternative for the development and evolution of neighborhood looks like? What do you think? Yeah, what do you think it looks like?
Yeah. Yeah, and I wonder if gentrification is inevitable. I mean, I don't know if it's inevitable in the way that it currently manifests. You know, I think we've understood it as like this is the way it goes, but I think that our imagination is much more powerful than just rote capitalism. You know, and I think that's what we're seeing played out is that, you know, like in Wicker Park now, like it's sometimes hilarious, like what store will pop up. You know what I mean? You're like there's no way that you're gonna sell all that matcha. Do you know what I mean? Like that's just that's impossible. It can't just be like a matcha. It can't just be like oat milk butter bars. That's impossible. You know what I mean? And I think then it becomes on us about, you know, well, what we can, let's say we're moving into a neighborhood that we are potential gentrifiers in. I think that there are strategies for us to be involved in like community policing meetings to encourage the police to not chase off the block people who have been there for a generation or two. I think we can, get involved in our local school, local school council, local school board. We can continue to support small businesses. I live in Uptown right now, and I've noticed that, in the last few years, some of the smaller hardware stores are closing because that giant ass Target just plopped down like a spaceship. And I think if we were to go to the small businesses that have been there for generations, that supports an economy that is operating sometimes not outside of the context of capitalism, but outside of the context of like macro global capitalism, and then you keep dollars in the neighborhood. And I think if you keep dollars in the neighborhood, you potentially keep jobs in the neighborhood. If you keep jobs in the neighborhood, potentially you can keep people who are living in the neighborhood staying in the neighborhood. And I think we are culpable and responsible for that. But I think there also needs to be systemic change, and again, I think that goes to policy, and that also goes to when there's these, giant developments, what is in that initial plan? Our notion of urban planning seems to be to erase the urbanity from the plan, that everything looks like the strip mall in the suburbs. And I feel like that's not fresh. And part of what I think at a metaphoric level, what I fear is monoculture. I mean, I fear that actually, but like, I'm not a farmer, but I understand that like when you plant just corn, you will dead the earth, but if you plant a, diverse crop and you got like radishes and lettuces, y'all have eaten vegetables. Like if you have like many things planted in the ground, that soil is rich, And I think the same is true of culture. And so if it's only one kind of person who now gets to afford to live in a particular place, that place is going to die, And yeah, so I think it's also like some forethought about what kind of spaces do we want to live in, Yeah. Yeah, y'all. Okay, I don't know how this is going to happen.
I'm going to let you throw.
Yeah, all right.
So I like that you paint this picture of a culture being a lot of connections between people. And I wonder if you've seen a trend, because it's become so much easier to stay at home with so much targeted media and fragmented media. Nothing is really in the zeitgeist anymore. At least that's how I feel. Have you seen in neighborhoods that haven't been gentrified a decrease in this sort of community that goes to the dive bar?
That's a good question. I think that we're always. This is a hope. I mean, I hope that we will resist the lure of the macro computer, like the supercomputer that's in our pocket, and it's hard, and I get that, and I struggle with that too. But I think that we'll always gravitate towards some sort of interpersonal, human-to-human, skin-to-skin type of connection. And so I think that for the most part, like alcohol sales are pretty steady. I'm not, please correct me, but And you know, I think that like also like come January 20, like we'll probably have like bud bars and all these different things that continue to get people into public space with one another. And I think you can't replace the live experience. You know, I think it's why theater, I mean, although what is on stage a lot of times is a problem, that it's not representative of who is in the city. Some of that's changing. But I think like theater has survived, you know, millennia because of that desire to be with one another in an environment where something's happening. It's why sport continues to be an experiential, live notion, and why we go to games if you can afford to go to them. But I think the live experience will continue to get us out of our environment, out of our home, and so it's part of the reason why we program so much, you know. And so we're trying to also shift the offerings of what someone gets in a public space, you know. And you know, I was raised in what, you know, KRS-One called to be like edutainment, you know, education through entertainment. And I think that there is something that if it is cursory, if it is only bubblegum, then sometimes we won't go back because we know that it's bad for us. You know what I mean? Whereas if there are more interesting public events, spaces, cultural happenings to go to that also maybe feeds a different part of our soul as opposed to just the, you know, desire to be instantaneously gratified, I think that, you know, we can come back to that. I think it's part of the reason why in our space, like we get kids who are traveling an hour and a half to hang out on a Tuesday night with other like nerdy ass, brilliant, very cool kids, and they do it repeatedly. You know what I mean? We'll see the same crew for sometimes like months at a time, and they'll just form this like clique, and just because there's that, you know, I think innate human need, I think, you know, to be, you know, like a computer can't see us, even with FaceTime. You know what I mean? The minute that clicks off, it's like we're then by ourselves again. And I think that there is a power and an import to being by yourself, but I also think that we need like the warmth of someone else's spirit next to us, you know? Yeah. I know yeah.
Cool talk. 2 questions. The first is your poems, some of the poems that you read were very much a love letter to the neighborhood of the past. What's it like for you to go to that same neighborhood, like Wicker Park? Do you see, like today, what do you see? Anything that, you know, makes you feel nostalgic for those days of the past that actually, I don't know, make you smile? And the second question is, what streets did you go up at?
Okay. All right. So, well, first, I was born at a hospital, Michael Reese Memorial, but I lived on Roscoe and Broadway. I lived at in a coach house. Huh? Yeah. Right. Exactly. Yeah. It wasn't Treasure Island in the day. But it used to be like Broadway used to have a lot of delis, and again, I'm Jewish, and so we used to, you know, me and my aunt would like, we knew all the spots to get the right matzo ball soups. You know what I mean? And then we moved around in that neighborhood a lot. And then I went to Jewish day school at Anchi Emmett at Pine Grove and Grace for a while. Wicker Park now, I mean, Young Chicago Authors is at 1180 North Milwaukee, and we've been in the neighborhood for 26, 7, 8 years. We used to be down Division Street at Damon, and now we're at that intersection of Milwaukee, Division, and Ashland. And so Roman runs the newspaper stand. That's the illustrator of the book, Langston Alston, painted. So there's the last poem in the book gets like a visual treatment on Roman's newsstand. Roman's been in the neighborhood for, I think, 50 years maybe. And if you go talk to him, like introduce yourself because he can't see, but he will give you like a very problematic, you know, racist rundown of the neighborhood, but he reminds me of the old neighborhood. There's like a place you could get borscht that's right next to Roman's newsstand. There's moments, you know, like when Sharkula pops up on Milwaukee Avenue. There's another visual artist who sells his wares usually near Sub T on the weekends. He reminds me of the old neighborhood. They still have some of the dive bars in the neighborhood. You know, Phyllis's. You know, even though it was just bought, what's that joint on Division? Just Nick, what's that joint? It's Gold Star. Thank you, Nick. Nick's like, yeah, fam. I've been to all these bars. today, earlier. Nick and I work at YCA. We've had some beverages together. And some of those places remind me, I think we filmed at Gold Star. We filmed at J&M Tavern and Happy Village for the video. So all those places kind of, they still look the same. They still smell the same, for better and for worse. But yeah, even architecturally, the place has changed. It's unrecognizable. Nelson Algren, the Polish Triangle, aka Nelson Algren Square, still reminds me of the neighborhood because the pigeons are still there, and so there's shit everywhere, and that I think of that fondly, Yeah, man. Okay. Yeah. Wow. That was not that bad, actually. That was a pretty good toss.
Hello.
I think maybe you could have called. Is that a microphone?
It is, yeah.
Yeah.
It's just the. It's
I
the
thought it was. I thought y'all are like Lord of the Flies in here. We're gonna have to battle for who gets out.
Yeah, right.
I'm looking at Nick, be like, Nick, keep the doors open, fam. It's a talk.
So, just thinking a lot about. I have the cube now.
I'm slow.
I'm glad that Nas wasn't right. Hip hop's not dead, and the industry has just changed so much. And I love hearing you talk about just working with young artists and really getting to help them craft their stories. And one of the things too is street heralds and people talking about their circumstance. And there is the inherent thread of hip hop in its evolution, utilizing storytelling and lyricism as a means to escape their own circumstances, whether they're on a daily basis they feel that their lives are being threatened and other not so pleasant things like that. When working with these young students and then talking about retaining culture of neighborhoods and really encouraging people to stay and let that artistry just become more and more vibrant, it's just the parallel between utilizing hip hop as a means to escape. How do you work with your students to tell their story, but then also thinking about kind of the means that justify the ends?
Yeah. It's a big question. I think some ways at it is that, one, I think that hip hop has always been, it has always dreamed of a different reality too. Even though Melly Mel also, reported about the, conditions of the Bronx, broken glass everywhere, people pissing on the corner like they just don't care. They were also, Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five were also adorning their bodies with giant furs and leathers and shit that maybe you couldn't afford on a daily basis, but you would costume yourself in order to also appear that you were achieving maybe a different socioeconomic reality. And then you had early on in hip hop, I think, a kind of capitalist dream, that has since been fulfilled by folks like Diddy and Dre and Jay and all these other folks who have kind of achieved that dream. So I think we get a lot of that too. I think that hip hop remains a kind of working person's almost folk art. And I say that with the utmost respect for folk art. And it is an American music that is still running through the tropes of what it means to be an American. As hip-hop also expands internationally, of course, you get then the tropes of what it is to be Colombian or Japanese or what have you. And I think in America, you still get some of that capitalist dreaming. I think that hip-hop, because it's also a part of the African diaspora, also partakes in some of the other literary and oral traditions in that art form. And so, that notion of Afro or Black futurism, I think, lends itself nicely into a kind of futuristic thinking, both for oneself, one's family, and one's community, that appears a lot in hip-hop, and particularly in some of the writers that we then bring into the classroom. There's a woman in Chicago named Krista Franklin, who is a collage artist and poet, who has a book coming out in the spring that is very much about wrestling with history and the moment, but also dreaming of a future that looks very different than even a perceived kind of reality. And so I think that the imagination can kind of get you anywhere. And I think I myself aesthetically am a kind of realist, because that's the kind of art that I like. But I also will bring in other kinds of stuff into the classroom, because I want young people to experiment with every aspect of their imagination too. And I think ultimately that kind of experimentation with your imagination can also then have you see yourself in a situation that is beyond the situation you're in now. And I think that that is very powerful. Yeah, thank you. How did I just realize that was a microphone though?
Hey, I've also got a hip hop related question. You spoke a little bit about your time in in the neighborhoods and going to parties and stuff like that in the '90s. I think people know a lot about like the West Coast relationship with hip hop in the '90s, East Coast relationship. What was that scene like in Chicago, and what was your relationship with that scene?
Yeah, and I love those stories. I mean, I love traveling, and we do a podcast on WGN called The Corner Store, and so when I'm traveling of late, especially, I've been trying to interview folks who have been around at the offset of that local hip-hop moment and scene to get some of those stories. In Chicago, Chicago is a house community, house being a dance music that was innovated in some ways like out of a style of late disco in New York, out of a place called The Garage, where a DJ named Larry Levan was playing. And there was a promoter in Chicago, Robert Williams, who went to New York and tried to get Larry to come to Chicago to play some of the parties that he was throwing. And Larry said, "Fam, you see what is happening here. Why would I ever leave?" And his man, someone who helped Larry get records, a DJ by the name of Frankie Knuckles, said, "Well, shit, I'll go." And Robert then booked Frankie Knuckles, and Frankie developed a style of music that became known as house because it was at a club called The Warehouse, and people would ask record shops for that house music, and that's how house got named. And house, of course, was a space in Chicago that queer, Black, and Latinx men were carving out at a time where queerness was being criminalized, in that Reagan era, in the onset of the AIDS epidemic. And eventually, they carved out spaces where they invited literally everybody to the party. And I have a friend, Boogie McLaren, who is a house historian and choreographer and philosopher, and she talks about house's notion of radical inclusivity, that if you could get down at a party, you were welcome to get down, especially if you operated within the mores of the culture. And so hip-hop came in as an export from New York into that house space. And so it's interesting. Hip-hop itself, one of the untold stories about hip-hop as a culture is that hip-hop has very queer origin stories. Hip hop also originates in the balls of New York. Like Pose now kind of replicates some of this on FX, but there's a great documentary, Paris is Burning, that you see like original b-boy, b-girl style in some of those parties. In Chicago, I think that it was hard to find break beats because the BPM was so high at house parties, and that DJs, if you liked it, had to kind of throw it in subtly, which is why early Chicago rappers rhymed so quickly, and why you have one of the early breakout stars of Chicago, Twista, rhyming so quickly, in part because it's a kind of like melodic blues thing, but also because the BPM in Chicago is turned up. So Twista, Do or Die, Psychodrama, they're all rhyming very quick because of those early kind of negotiations and scraping between house and what would become a vibrant hip-hop community. I also think what happened in Chicago is that Chicago's literary scene is so tied to Chicago's music scene, and the arts, for the most part, know each other in the city, that Chicago writers who became rappers were so gifted with the pen, and I think that remains the case now, where some of the best MCs to come out of Chicago are so gifted with the pen, and we make a kind of literary contribution to the culture in that way, But you'd be hard pressed in the day to like go to a hip hop party. Like I don't think that there were like hip hop parties until 91 really. There'd be like underground shit, but never a club. Like you would never go to a club. Jesse De La Pena used to run at what is now closed at the Elbow Room, a night called the Blue Groove Lounge that I think maybe started in like the early 90s. And there was the B-Side Cafe, there was the Blue Groove Lounge, and there was a place called the China Club in Fulton Market that's no longer there. And those were the only spaces you could go to see hip hop regularly, but you would hear about shit through the DJs and the record buyers at Gramophone Records, because the Mole Men crew, which put on for hip hop in Chicago in the 80s and 90s, were DJ producers that worked there, and they would then slide you like a flyer for a b-boy battle or some event that they were throwing, and that's how it kind of began to proliferate, I would say. Yeah. But it was. I'm sorry. I know that we're wrapping up, but it would be the thing where you would see someone dressed on the train in a way that just only it seemed like hip hoppers dressed, and there were so few in the city at the time. You would just go up to them and be like, "Yo, do you like hip hop?" And that became your friend. Do you know what I mean? And that's how I found my first friends. I got I as a kid, 12, 13 years old, and I asked a kid who clearly was a graffiti writer. I'm like, "Yo, do you write graffiti?" He's like, "Yes." And he was the king of the Red Line train and took me from 95th to Howard, just showing me the pieces him and his crew did on the train. And I'm like, "Oh shit, this is the best thing I've ever seen." You know what I mean? And that's how you found friends in the day, or at least how I did. I didn't have a lot of friends. Anyway, yeah.
Okay, another question online. Do you see anything currently in any Chicago neighborhoods that you feel is a step in the right direction when dealing with gentrification? Are there any movements or organizations you know of that you feel are doing something novel?
Yeah, I mean, all the time, I think that Chicago has the best innovators culturally, on the planet. And, I think there's a project that the homie who's a really talented photographer, Tanika Johnson, is doing called the Folded Map series. You guys know, she's been here. Hey, look at y'all on it. Yeah, we've been known. I love Tanika. I love that work. And I think that people who are intentionally trying to desegregate the city are, for me, make me the most excited. There's a, what's his name? Jamal Crawford? My Block, My Hood, My City. He's doing interesting things. Sweetwater Foundation is doing interesting things in terms of job readiness, preparedness, and urban farming. We work with a lot of cultural organizations at Young Chicago Authors. I think Young Chicago Authors is doing that work very intentionally, has been for a long time. The homie Ad2 has built a space called Haven Studios at 47th and King, and it's basically become, in the basement of a church, an after-school hip-hop program. The homie Navarro, who is a rapper from the crew called the Mole Men, also just started this project / label called Loop Theory, and he is very intentionally bringing different kinds of genres of music together in the same space. So, I like all of this. I think on Sunday nights at the Metro, you could go to the Party Queen. This seems to be one of the most vibrant parties that remind me of parties back in the day. I think these are some of the orgs that are doing interesting work. Iman, the Inner City Muslim Action Network, continues to do really important work, building spaces, health clinics, and transition programs from prison to jobs in the southwest side of the city on 63rd, but also all over the city. So that's just off top, but I think I mean, I'm also, oh man, who's doing great work too is you'd be like, yeah, we know, fam. We saw her yesterday. Tanya Lozano and Healthy Hood in Pilsen are doing great work around physical movement shit. They have, you could take a Zumba class or karate class or a hip hop dance class in their space in Pilsen, and they are just launched this big mental health initiative called Get Your Mind Right, which is about securing with mental health practitioners pro bono sessions for people who can't afford a psychiatrist or psychologist, and all these healers she's kind of built with, and they're all giving X number of pro bono sessions to people in the community for. And so Tanya is very dope too. But I got it's a lot of these folks do great work. Yeah. Okay. How are we doing time wise? I'm just for me. I'm good. You know what I mean? Okay, yeah, I saw maybe those two, and then
something that I've been especially fascinated by is your use of vocabulary, where we're talking about gentrification and all these things, but you're using ill and dope, but also using pedagogically. And so I guess how conscious and intentional are you in curating your vocabulary for, I guess, like particular spaces, but also just in the way you live your life?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'm also raised on MTV Raps, and so I have like a particular kind of, it's like I have in one of my books I have a book called Shtick, which is about how Jews became white in America, and in it I have, because I get a similar question a lot, not as well phrased or thoughtful, and I appreciate your thoughtfulness. Most times people are like, "Why you talk like that?" Which is a fair question. And I think it's because I grew up in so many different spaces that I was always straddling so many different spaces, and that I think that I learned that words were tools, and especially because I knew that I started to write rhymes when I was probably 13, 14 years old. And it was at a time when, Big Daddy Kane had like an incredible vocabulary that I had to look shit up in the library or in the dictionary to understand what he was saying. And so I began to understand then the power of basically like arming yourselves with words. And then, of course, like the delight in slang is that it's also a manipulation of a similar kind of technology, the word being a kind of technical tool. I think that in the poem I talk about, just these are the tongues that are in my mouth. You know what I mean? Like I grew up also at my aunt's Seder table, and I also grew up, with b-boys in the back of a bus. And so it's the amalgamation of those things that get me to sound like I sound, even though I think I walk in a room sometimes and people imagine I'm going to look or sound differently, or, people, if they read my resume, they'll be like, oh, a lot of times people are like, yo, I thought you were black. I'm like, I'm definitely not, And so I think that it is in part because we are so uncomfortable with mixedness in this country. Like miscegenation is something that we've kind of legislated against so often in this country, and that I am a product of very mixedness spaces. I am even being a Jew is part of the diasporic tradition, but then being like a wandering Jew in the city of Chicago and all the different socioeconomic spaces that I grew up in, it means that this is how I talk, Yeah. In the back, I think just like throw it like just alley-oop behind yourself.
Your talk really struck a chord with me because I live in Wicker Park at that corner of Division, Milwaukee, and Ashland.
Come to YCA, man.
Yeah, exactly. I do want to come by.
Please.
But I'm also a recent transplant from California. So some part of me feels like, am I part of the problem? Right? So what is the role of transplants like me, not necessarily in just the preservation, but also the evolution now of Wicker Park in these neighborhoods?
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, and I don't even think, I think that's so much to take on as an individual, and that guilt can produce a kind of apathy or immobility that is not productive. And so it's certainly, actually, fuck it, it's your fault, man. I'm sorry. Yeah, damn. I was looking for you, and no, it's like I think it's like, how do we be responsible citizens? And that's a question both in terms of a neighborhood, in terms of a city, in terms of the planet. And I think there are a lot of us who are trying to understand that, right? Given the climatic apocalyptic moment that we are living in. But I also think that translates to a block level, And so some of the things I was saying earlier, I think that there are strategies to be a responsible person, but also be a good neighbor. You know what I mean? The thing that I miss about the old Wicker is that when I would come out on Milwaukee Avenue, there'd be people on the street who would call my name. I was looked after. And even this is before I really had any friends in the neighborhood. Oba, who used to sell his poems for $1 on Milwaukee Avenue, he knew me because I was a poet and I used to sit at his feet trying to get the gems he would drop. He would call out my name. I was accounted for. You know what I mean? And I think that sometimes when we move in to a neighborhood, into a condo, we close ourselves off from the humanity that's around us. And to me, that is a kind of a border building, and as a Jew and as a hip hop kid, I believe in the messing of borders. I believe in the manipulation, the erasure of borders in a lot of ways. And so I think that all of those things that we put up in between one another are oftentimes because we're scared of the other. And I think to be a responsible citizen, in part, in a city like Chicago or anywhere, is to then really begin to lean into and understand that the other has a lot to share with us. We have a lot to learn from the other, and that we will be better off as an individual and as a society if we embrace that kind of otherness, actually. You know? Yeah. Thank you, bro. Thank you all so much, man. I appreciate y'all. You got some things. Yeah, no. Oh, you're going to do it.
Oh, yeah, if you want to.
No. What's your name, man?
Carl.
Carl. Thanks, Carl. So Nick and I, we brought some books, including Everything Must Go, but also some other things. So please take one. They make great holiday gifts. And for real, I'm a person in the city, as you are, and we have a space, Young Chicago Authors, and it is for everybody, not just the young in terms of age, but the young at heart. And we get, like in our Saturday writing programs, we get 77-year-olds who come and write with us. And so you're welcome to come check out the space. And I hope that this is not the last time that we engage, but that it's an ongoing process. And certainly would love to know more about what you guys do here, other than throw these boxes around with microphones in them. But please stay in tune. Our open mic is Tuesday night, every Tuesday night. We do a workshop at 6. We do an open mic at 7. Saturdays, we run a drop-in writing program for storytellers, poets at 1 o'clock. We do a similar workshop for songwriter rappers at 4 o'clock. And then throughout the course of a week, we do so many different kinds of programs, many of which are for folks who are 21 and up. So we program, right now we do monthlies at Soho House, the Hoxton, and Ace Hotel, and just a bunch of shit around the city. So, please stay in tune. The best way to stay in tune, I think, is probably just to holler on socials. It's just at my name, at Kevin Coval, IG or Twitter. And then, please pick up a book. And thank you so much for having me today and lending your time and your ears. I really, really appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.